Last week, we read a very beautiful passage of Aurobindo describing how the nexus, we may have to form a nexus between the psychic being and the higher consciousness, and replace it, if we may add, with the present nexus between the ego consciousness and the lower nature. It is this nexus that binds us to our present state. And through the psychic being, a nexus can be formed between the individual soul and the higher nature or supernature, whatever way we term it, to come down and change this earthly life. Last week, we read something about just a few hints and glimpses of this process, which Aurobindo has termed as spiritualization. The difference between a spiritual experience in the traditional yoga and spiritualization is that in traditional yoga, in some state of inwardness, in some state of trance, in some deep meditation, we sometimes have a glimpse of this reality or some glimpse of the higher consciousness, when the present consciousness, which is enclosed in a little box, something of it escapes. Very usually, one cannot stay there for long, just like we cannot stay in Mount Everest or even heights of Kanchenjunga for a long time. We become asphyxiated, beautiful though it is. Our human nature is not accustomed to that kind of consciousness. It's too subtle, too rare, too luminous. And as Aurobindo would tell us, our nature gets tired even of peace. Too much of peace also begins to tire us. We begin to become restless. An old subconscious pull of habit pulls us down. And many times one even forgets what one has experienced. Just there is a lingering trace of some joy, or sometimes the vision and the glory glimpsed. But when we come back to our all too human nature, it is the same old nature. It is the same old ways, maybe a little modified, maybe a little sattvicized, if one may use the word, but not psychicized or spiritualized. What Aurobindo wants is that this normal operation of human nature should be replaced by the divine operations of a higher nature. To take another example, today when a little baby is born, he is instinct, a human baby of course, he is instinct with all that human beings need to know and do. He doesn't have to be taught how to speak. He doesn't have to be taught how to eat, how to walk. He does it by a kind of ingrained instinct. It is equally true of animals. As they are born, certain elements are already in their nature which is appropriate to their own species. And so too with human beings, except in exceptional circumstances, of course. And then if one wants to go beyond this human nature, one has to struggle a lot. One has to work, labor, because human nature doesn't naturally turn towards it. Even after one has heard the call, still it's a difficult passage. There are letters of Aurobindo. In one of them he says, you have apparently a call for the yoga and may be fit even for this life. And then he says, but I must tell you that this yoga is not easy. So even when one has heard the call, it is not an easy thing, because human nature, there is nothing in human nature which supports this effort. Usually it is one point which is touched. And through that, in ancient yoga, one took advantage of that point as a fulcrum and catapulted oneself into the higher or the deeper layers. Some people for whom bhakti or emotions were very strongly turned towards the divine, they turned their emotions progressively towards the one beloved whom they seek, and a veil was rent, and they saw the face whom one searches amidst the million faces. Or in some way the mind was strong, the mind took hold of one thought, one idea, and by its insistence, a veil or the lid, a gap was rent in the lid, and for a while one escaped into the higher consciousness. But the rest remained unchanged. Or if one takes the wider path of karma, where eventually the streams of jnana and bhakti come and join, then one, by a progressive offering of all actions to the divine, discovers the one master behind this entire play of nature, and had its glimpse, and offering everything of oneself to that, became free, because that is a great assurance at the end of the journey. Yet the nature continued to remain, the rest of nature especially, struggling with the same old story. This must change, and that is what is being effected through this yoga. First, by a process of psychic change, which comes and sets the nature right, orients everything to the light and the right. There is a very beautiful sloka in the, I think, Svetashvatar Upanishad, where the Rishi says, Yam Pashyanti Antaha Sharire Jyotirmayo hi Shubhro Yam Pashyanti Ratehi Shine Dosha. There is a source of pure white light inside us, a flame, as Aurobindo says, a flame that cancels death in mortal things, immortal in our deathless poverty, artist of its own beauty and delight, sculpture of the forms of the infinite. So this little flame, whose darshan matra is enough to make many of the doshas become sheen, they become powerless, they cannot hold tight upon us. This grip of nature is broken. So this is the first stage. By the psychic touch, the mind and its thought, the heart and its feelings, the will and its strivings, even the body's movements, begin to assume more and more an orientation towards the light and the right. And if this has happened, then the rest of the process becomes safer. And if this has not happened, Sri Aurobindo again cautions us, and the lid above the mind is rent, and there is an influx of spiritual experiences, then there may be a greater disaster which may await us. Because it is only proper that first the psychic must come and orient the nature in a correct way. That's why repeatedly we find in Sri Aurobindo's letters, in the works, triple transformation, in Savitri itself, the first step is the psychic change. Once the process of spiritualization starts, we read last time, there are four main aspects of the higher consciousness: light or knowledge, wideness and peace, ananda, bliss, love, whichever way we look at it, sweetness, all aspects of ananda, and power or force. These are the four aspects, and any of them can descend, but Sri Aurobindo tells us again, it is much better if peace descends first and clears the nature. If the nature is very restless and turbulent, then again the higher powers, as they enter into the lower nature and its field, they can create a lot of storm, raise a lot of storm. And it is for this reason that we find again there is such an insistence on rejection. When speaking of the difference between the yoga of the Gita and this yoga, there are quite a few. The yoga of the Gita takes us very far, but it's not exactly transformation of nature. So one of them, of course, is, we know that the instrumental nature must change in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, but not in the yoga of the Gita. The instrumental nature remains the same, but surrendered. One becomes an instrument of the divine, but the instrument is still the same faulty instrument. The second, of course, he says that rejection is a very important part of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. And for this very reason, because as these higher powers come down, and if the lower nature is still holding on insistently, then either the force may be spilt over or the adhar may break down. There is a little Zen story which is in a different context but so very true, that a professor goes to meet a master and he says, I have come to receive knowledge. So the master says, all right, come my child, have a cup of tea. And the disciple comes and he starts pouring tea. So he says to the disciple to pour tea, and he is pouring tea. And he doesn't say to stop. So like an obedient disciple, he doesn't stop. He keeps pouring, and the cup is filled, and then it flows over, and then it touches the tablecloth, And then it finally falls on the professor's dress. So like all of us, we are, the only time we react when we are hurt personally. So the professor gets up and says, "But sir, the cup is full." So the master says, "Just like you. So if you want knowledge, must empty the cup. If the cup is full, already with all kinds of information." Aurobindo uses a very beautiful term when he speaks in different places, and of course this from the human cycle, where he says the first thing necessary is a transference of the central faith and will. And if this does not happen, then no amount of spiritual experiences change the nature. It still remains like a religion. One of the differences between religion and spirituality is, in religion, the central faith and will remain where we are. We want this life which is there to satisfy the ego. We believe in our own powers, maybe the power of reason, where our present consciousness is centered, but something within the lower nature is what is all important to us. And the life is lived to fulfill that and satisfy that. We admit God, but only that much of God which will help us prolong and extend the empire of the ego-ridden life. That's why books like 7 Laws of Success or Spirituality for Success are such an instant hit. This is another kind of religion because spirituality at the service of the human ego. Powers, even spiritual powers at the service of the human ego. And this can lead to a complete disaster in sadhana. Aurobindo repeatedly cautions us, and he even tells us that in the ancient times, there were 2 kinds of people who were attracted towards yoga. One, the godlike nature, which did not go for powers, but for surrendering oneself, for giving oneself. The second, which was attracted to grab power, and that was the asuric nature. And power without purification of nature, without the essential knowledge in the background, can be devastating. We have read somewhere, some other time, those lines in Savitri, where Aurobindo describes this descent as in a moment shorter than death, longer than time, by a power more ruthless than love. We cannot imagine what is analogy. Love can be ruthless because that divine love is so powerful. The love of Mahakali, it brooks no obstacle when it comes down streaming into the system. That's why Aurobindo says, who can truly possess Krishna? He whom Kali already possesses. She must come and clear the entire ground. There should be nothing given to the ego. Then Krishna can come, his sweetness and Ananda can fill the being. So these are the flowings from the higher consciousness, and number of experiences Aurobindo describes in the letter and the life divine which can come as a result. For instance, when knowledge descends, the faculties of spontaneous inspiration, Shruti, Smriti, intuition, revelations can come flaming forth, not only in the mind, but also in the heart. Not only in the heart, but they can also inform the will, and they can go to an extent that they can even inform the body. The body itself can become instinct with a new knowledge, which can show it what needs to be done for the body's sake, even the right gesture. And one can go to any extent with this knowledge. It's something very powerful. Even there are some examples, not some examples, I know one example where, a person, a great saint whom the mother herself has said that he is a great yogi, and he also had a very high regard for Aurobindo. And he used to treat people in a most unconventional way. When people went to him asking for some problem, he would suddenly say, okay, you take, somebody would say, you take a banana and take it for 3 days, you'll be fine. To someone else, he gave a totally different thing with the same problem. Right for the body, what is needed for each body. It can be a knowledge which can go to any extent of details. Because in knowledge itself, as it enters into the human system, consciousness, there are 2 aspects. One is the essential knowledge, and that is also revealed as the higher consciousness opens its door. The knowledge of the silent self, of the one divine everywhere, in everything, whose hand we begin to feel in every circumstance of life and behind every object. And of course, the most difficult of all, the human persona, behind which also we can begin to feel the divine. Somebody asked this of the mother, that why is it so difficult to feel divine in human beings? It's so much easier to feel it in plants, flowers, rock, mountains, rivers, sun, everywhere. But in human beings, there is something which kind of veils it so thoroughly. And the mother said, because of the ego individuality which is so strong in the human nature, so difficult to pierce it. Nevertheless, this is one of the aspects of knowledge, that it can reveal to us the essential self, oneself, the silent self behind all things. And taking anything as an occasion, as this knowledge enters, one can enter into this silent space of the soul. Then apart from that, the knowledge is this other aspect, how this self relates with the world, knowledge of the play of forces, knowledge of the hidden motives, knowledge of the will that is working in the cosmos. It can extend itself to any amount. So these are just some of the preliminary results. As Ananda streams it again, Aurobindo would tell us, this Ananda not only is something which is felt on the peaks of the human mind or the human consciousness, but this is an Ananda which can touch every layer of the being. It can fill the heart with a sense of joy that knows no limits, the boundlessness and the ecstasy of God's embrace. It can inform the will, so that in all our activities there is this constant Ananda. It's not only when one is feeling the divine presence inside, but in every activity, because this Ananda can fulfill the will. It doesn't matter, the activity may be a success, it may be a failure. It may move according to our preferences. They should not be there, of course, or it may move completely other than what we had planned. And yet in that effort, there is the delight, because that sustains the effort. And this delight, this Ananda can even enter the body, and the very body cells can be thrilled and swept by that mighty blaze of Ananda. So too with peace, this peace is not only in the mind and the thoughts, but in the heart, in the feelings, in the will and its strivings, and in the very body stuff. And as we were reading last time, that this peace can be curative and even illnesses and suffering. So it's a very practical thing to have this higher consciousness. If for nothing else, we will reduce the medical bills and the medical expenditure. Of course, our own, not others. We should not give lectures to others. When people come, we should not tell them, have peace and contact with the presence. It's only for ourselves. We can try it on ourselves, and it really works. It's something wonderful. And Mother has given so many ways to do that. And of course, this power. There is a very beautiful note of the Mother which was found among her notes, where she says, these are the things I want to bring down as gifts to earth and men. 1, 2, 3, 4, it goes on to 12. Perfect consciousness, omniscience, omnipotence, the power over circumstances, complete immunity against accidents, complete immunity against adverse forces, the gift of healing, the gift of tongues, the power of perfect expression in every field, in art, in science, in every field, because this is a power which can reveal itself. And at the end she says, and all else that is necessary for thy work upon earth. So there is no limit, this power which can descend and empower, if we may use a modern term, the consciousness, and it can make itself practically immune against so many things. And there are so many instances in Mother and Aurobindo's own life and in the life of their disciples, that this power came, intervened suddenly and changed the entire course of circumstances and fate. So this is what she wants to bring down as a boon upon earth. We read the same thing in Savitri, when the 4 boons corresponding to the 4 powers or aspects of the higher consciousness, Savitri asks, if this were all, the story would be very nice and beautiful. All that we have to do is to concentrate within and above. As Aurobindo says, concentrating in the heart. We have to concentrate also in the head, and later on above the head. We have to simply make our will one-pointed by offering all works to the divine, make our heart one-pointed by turning all emotions to the divine, make our thoughts one-pointed by holding one single idea, the very highest in our consciousness, and everything would happen automatically. But there comes the problem. And the problem is that there are 3 consenting parties to this effort of change. Aurobindo puts it very beautifully. I think it's in the synthesis, where he says, there must be at least 3 consenting parties in the yoga. One is the divine. He has consented, that's why one has heard the call. There is that famous sentence of Aurobindo, he who has chosen the infinite has already been chosen by the infinite. So first part is already there. that he has consented. The second is the soul. It must be have a call, and this call must be genuine. It's not just that yoga is not an intellectual curiosity or an experiment. It is too mighty and too strong for it. It's not worth doing it just for an intellectual curiosity. Let me see whether there is something like this or not, whether it works or not. It's not for some petty gains. So it's a serious effort, and the call must be there in the soul. And the third, which is very important, he says, is nature. The soul may have felt the call, and the divine may have consented, but the nature may not be ready, and that may break down under the effort. Especially when the psychic key is not held, and one wants to force through the gates and the kingdoms of heaven. This especially happens when one does the sadhana under the stress of the vital, and one wants to have experiences for their own sake, or there is some ambition of becoming a great sadhak, great yogi, or maybe a great leader. And when yoga is done under some such ambition and the gap is suddenly rent, that is the time that there are various dangers. And the mother points out, and same thing Aurobindo mentions in the Life Divine, in the Triple Transformation, two main dangers which may arise like a real storm of resistance. One is ambition, and the second is the sexual impulse. So if there is lack of purity in the motive, if there is the ambition to be a superman, sometimes even there is a great ambition. One reads Aurobindo and says, oh, it will make us immortal, not realizing that this whole personality will undergo such a change that it's the entire death of the ego. And Aurobindo says repeatedly that do not pursue this yoga to become a superman or to become like Mother and Aurobindo, because it will straight lead us into the abyss of self-aggrandizement. It is nothing but the ego which would want to become like that, or even to become a great yogi or a superman. These things are not the aim of the yoga. They are the consequence of this yoga. They are the gifts of this yoga which if she chooses, she can bestow. But that's not important. Yoga is not pursued for that end. And Aurobindo repeatedly cautions us. But if one does it, and that is why he says, and the mother says, it's a real adventure. Why it's an adventure? The first part of the journey has been known. There have been earlier instances where people have come in contact with the higher consciousness and had experience of the divine. But this is the first time in the history of the universe that something such an unprecedented thing is happening. The higher consciousness coming and striking the roots of the lower consciousness right in its abysses. And what may happen? And that's why we see that for a long time she had confined this experiment to a small community of sadhaks, which is the ashram, where each human being represented a human type, how he would respond to the new consciousness. And the entire process was controlled. It was coming directly through the physical persona of Mother and Aurobindo. And all the things that people threw at the higher consciousness were going through their persona. It was like a filter. Her body worked like a shield. Otherwise, in one of the places she says, now that the supermind has come, humanity may face a lot of blows, because supramental consciousness is a truth consciousness. It doesn't care. It can annihilate a whole universe and recreate it. But she shielded. She did the experiment, prepared in human nature many things. Aurobindo, in one of his letters, would say, you people think it's just like pulling the supermind down. I have to see that the human nature is ready, otherwise the fuse may blow off. So the entire nature has to be prepared in the process, and if it doesn't, instead of changing, it may experience a lot of rise of resistances from below. Aurobindo himself describes that how anger, which was completely foreign to his nature, he experienced it suddenly rising up in some of the early stages of this yoga. And the same, because one reason is that it is a truth consciousness and nothing can remain hidden. So we may start the process hiding the motives, but as the process starts penetrating deeper and deeper layers, at some point of time, one has to confront what is hidden inside. And that explains many things which we find many times uncomfortable and disconcerting. That how come someone for many years was practicing yoga and suddenly this happened? This is part of the process. And if one is held on to her, or more importantly, has been held by her, then the process one goes through it and goes beyond it. But if not, if one has relied on one's own effort or on the ego or some such power of the human consciousness, then Sri Aurobindo says there are several possibilities. Either one stops halfway through with a partial experience. This is the best possible scenario among the stoppages. It's arrested development, and the mother would put it abortive species, like a transition. One stops in one life at a point and would resume the effort in another life. Or the power withdraws and something of its lingering remains, which may be used by undivine and adverse forces. Sri Aurobindo cautions in the Life Divine that the power and the presence withdraw, but its stamp is left on the consciousness and it can be used by that. Or else the Adhar may completely break under the pressure, and at least for one life the process gets arrested. So these are the difficulties of the actual change, and that is why repeatedly Mother and Sri Aurobindo insist on making the Adhar strong and ready of all the things, the physical Adhar, because otherwise how can one bear the pressure? Even a little emotion, little joy, and it's spilled. This is another possibility, that all that descends is spilled into channels. This energy which enters into us is spilled into very many usual, useless human activities, and everything becomes hustle and bustle and lost forever. So these are the cautions, and that's why the process of purification and the psychic change, which is insisted repeatedly on them. Yet the great assurance, as in Savitri they say, but there is a guardian power. There are hands that save. Calm eyes divine regard the human scene. So what is needed is, through this entire journey, which has its own share of adventure and its own share of misadventures, Sri Aurobindo says so beautifully, if you are flying an aircraft, you cannot afford to misconduct the aeroplane. Recently we had this incident that mid-air people went into a fight, the air hostess and the pilot. And it's very interesting, it's really symbolic of the inner journey. That when you're flying a high-tech aircraft where the lives of so many people are at stake, and you start turning that occasion into having a kind of affair, it can be so dangerous, because your life and everybody's life can be threatened. There is another place for that. So similarly he says, if as one progresses in this yoga, and the more these resistances arise, one can be really swept off one's feet, unless one is constantly focused on the aim and constantly has learned to surrender constantly and refer everything to the Divine Mother. And that is why this insistence. Even the illnesses, the mother says it's not that yoga causes illnesses or the higher consciousness causes illnesses, but the resistances of human nature which arise. So there are two sides of this effort. One is the grace, and the second is the readiness of human nature. If human nature is not ready, the result may appear to outer eye, maybe after a while just the very opposite of what should have happened. But even this, the Mother and Sri Aurobindo assure us, it is a passage. There is a very beautiful documentary that I watched some time back. It was on how the fish evolved into a creature of land, evolved into a creature of the creature of sea, evolved into a creature of land. This was a very big transition, because it is a transition which marked the beginning of a whole new journey of evolution. Till then the evolution was in water, and now suddenly there must be creature who must walk on land. So fins must change into something like a feet. So fingers must come in its place. The entire gills must change into proper lungs which can breathe air. The whole apparatus has to change. The way one draws oxygen. And these scientists kept on finding that there must be some missing link, because one of the problem was no missing link could be found. So they tried and tried and tried, finding one link after another, but they discovered all these links were not the real link. All these were abortive species. These were efforts of nature which didn't work out. So they came, they went. They came, they disappeared. They came, they disappeared. At the end, something very small and insignificant like a mudfish. Those of us who have seen it, it's so tiny. That is the creature which came out, and could stay in the mud and jump, and it had everything which marked the first transition from the giant shark to the human being. That transition was through a tiny little mudfish. And perhaps that is what is meant in the biblical phrase, the meek and the weak shall inherit the earth. Because it's through that humility which is the safeguard, that surrender which is the safeguard, and a little mudfish comes out and will one day span its wings and run and fly an aircraft and become a human being and aspire and dream of the divine. So the similar process will take place here. The mother has spoken of many abortive species which would come, many intermediate stages which would come, and the possibilities are almost endless. Because the higher consciousness is not one thing, and the experiences of the higher consciousness are also not a single monotone, and many shades and many kinds of lanes, by-lanes, paths will open. And when this consciousness acts upon human nature, the new possibilities will arise. Possibilities of a complete change, sudden and swift change, and the possibility of a complete breakdown. So between this range, most of us move. So let us leave aside the breakdown part and read something from Savitri, that this change is luminous and beautiful and harmonious, because the nature is already prepared by the psychic being, and now the descent of the spiritual consciousness opens it just as a flower opens to the touch of the sun. And what happens as a result is beautifully described in Savitri. This is from book 7, the book of Yoga, Canto 5, the finding of the soul. And the pages are 529 to 531. I'll read some selections. This process of psychicization followed by a spiritualization all underwent a high celestial change. Powers and divinities burst flaming forth, each part of the being trembling with delight. The entire Ananda, not just in one part, the entire being, even the very body, lay overwhelmed with tides of happiness, and saw her hand in every circumstance, and felt her touch in every limb and cell. The very start is so beautiful that if that can happen to us, how beautiful life would be. We would shrink from nothing. That is one of the experiences in Ishupanishad. Who is the greatest of sages? He says, Tato na vijugupsate. And who is he who shrinks from nothing? He who sees oneness everywhere. And this comes as a result of spiritualization, and saw her hand in every circumstance, and felt her touch in every limb and cell. The immortal's thoughts displaced our bounded view. Then what happens in the level of the mind as this lotus opens? Normally, if you see from morning till night, our thoughts are nothing but mud, turned towards mud, rolling in the mud, enjoying the mud. But what happens when this change takes place? The immortal's thoughts displaced our bounded view. We are no more cabined by senses and the information they feed. Spontaneously, knowledge leaps forth and things are revealed which are not known to our bounded sight. The immortal's thoughts, Earth's drab idea and sense. What is this drab idea and sense? We have to just switch on 24/7 or any of the channels, and we see those analysts sitting there and analyzing events which totally, prophecies and everything go totally berserk within a few days. So this is Earth's drab idea and sense. All things now bore a deeper, heavenlier sense. Each shape showed its occult design unveiled, God's meaning in it for which it was made, and the vivid splendor of his artist thought. Everything, every object in this universe has at its core an idea and a will which manifest in the form, and that can be seen and contacted by the opening of this center of the knowledge. That is how when we look at a flower, we see only a flower. And what did Mother see? The aspiration, the psychic presence in the vegetal kingdom. So this is the process of the change. And this one can see in everything. And what happens to the will, which right now is, he describes it here much better, that a channel of the mighty mother's choice, the immortal's will took into its calm control. Right now, our will is divided into many, many contradictory wills. From morning to night, whatever our will builds up in one direction, we cancel by the other direction. So at the end of the day, we go back exactly where we started our journey with. And we say, what is this? And days and weeks and months and years pass by, nothing happens. But once this door opens and our will is surrendered to her, then our own will becomes a channel of the mighty mother's choice. The immortal's will took into its calm control. The difference between the divine will and this is that it's calm. It is not insistent, not rigid, not restless, not turbulent, not expecting this result and becoming nervous and agitated and excited if it doesn't come through. And what does it take into control? Our blind or erring government of life. Once a loose republic of wants and needs, life now obeyed a diviner rule. Otherwise, it's like what happens in the parliament, that happens inside us, and the speaker is the only person who is silent, who doesn't speak. So the soul, which is meant to be the adhisthata, doesn't speak, and everything else is a cacophony. And every act became an act of God. It didn't matter what one did. The smallest of things became an act of God because it became luminous. There is such beautiful thing in Savitri when the description is of Savitri going into Satyavan's house. She sweeps the floor, she takes care of the household, everything. And everything is divine in her movements because every act became an act of God. And then in the heart, the change that takes place as this higher consciousness descends and the lotus of the heart opens. In the kingdom of the lotus of the heart, love, chanting its pure, hymeneal hymn, made life and body mirrors of sacred joy. Love brings joy, but in human consciousness, this joy is turbulent, agitated, full of a fitful passion, a moment's thrill, followed by darkness, obscuration, hatred, all these things. But this love brings with it a sacred joy. And all the emotions gave themselves to God. Nothing was left for anything else. And even when one loved human beings and animals or anything in creation, this universal love was reaching to the divine within. And then it comes down still further. In the navel lotus, broad imperial range, its proud ambitions and its master lust. This is the seat of the maximum trouble. That's why most problems take place either in this area or in the abdominal area, because this is the seat of maximum resistance. It's the seat where ambitions and lusts, they have their sway. So what change takes place there? Were tamed into instruments of a great calm sway to do a work of God on earthly soil. All our ambitiousness and lust for this, greed for this changes into only one aspiration: to do the mother's work, to work for her, to give one's life completely at her feet. But this part doesn't stop here, it goes still further. In the narrow nether centers, petty parts, even there where pettiness resides, the small quarrels, the everyday friction of life over small things. What happens there? In the narrow nether centers, petty parts, its childish game of daily dwarf desires was changed into a sweet and boisterous play, a romp of little gods with life in time. These petty parts which are constantly clinging to small things, that change into a play of little gods in time. So that humor, it changes into a play of joy and ananda. And finally there came a grip on matters, giant powers. For large utilities in life's little space, a firm ground was made for heaven's descending might. So this is the kind of groundwork that needs to be done for the change of the human into the diviner kind. But once the hidden doors are flung apart, then the veiled king steps out in nature's front. A light comes down into the ignorance. Its heavy, painful knot loosens its grasp. All the suffering, all the pain, all the struggle that we experience in life loosens its grasp. The mind becomes a mastered instrument, and life a hue and figure of the soul. All happily grows towards knowledge and towards bliss. Light and ananda become natural to us, not as now is ignorance and suffering. A divine puja then takes nature's place. So what is replaced in place of our struggling and striving nature? A divine puja, a divine power, and pushes the movements of our body and mind. And this can also be experienced, Aurobindo says, in the very physical. One can experience a push and a pressure, very common when first time one comes to ashram and goes to the samadhi. One feels as if one is drugged and wants to just sleep. One feels so much pressure on the head, and sometimes the thrill which passes right through the body. One has even forgotten that this used to happen, but this is such a common experience. And sometimes as a resistance in the very physical, Aurobindo says, one can experience headache, giddiness, even throbbing sensations. So here Aurobindo says, she streams into us with her unbound force. The experience of a thrill passing from the head to toe. Into mortal limbs, the immortals, rapture and power. This is what the Vedic Rishi aspired for the Soma wine. And they said that if the jar is unbaked, then when the Soma wine enters, it's like Niagara entering into a small little cup, it shatters. An inner law of beauty shapes our lives. Our words become a natural speech of truth. So whatever one says becomes true. That's why in the greatest of sages, even in the Vedic age, they used to call this light into the mind, not down further. And the power came down, and the word that were uttered became true. It was so important that, and even the divine respects this law. It is said that when a tapasvi who could bring down this power, and even there are instances like Gandhari was a tapaswini in her own right, Tulsi was a tapaswini. When she cursed even God, he says, I cannot let this curse not come true, because it is the law. It must become the natural speech of truth. So when this power of expression, this center is opened, what is uttered becomes the natural speech of truth. How beautiful it would be. So says, our words become the natural speech of truth. Each thought is a ripple on a sea of light. Then sin and virtue leave the cosmic lists. This is what is meant in the Gita, Trigunatit Bhav Savisachi. Dvandatit, the sin and virtue, the good and bad, the suffering and good fortune and misfortune, which are constantly struggling within us. It is not a sanction or a concession to go below sin and virtue into the animal state and do whatever one feels like in the name of freedom. The mother says, I want to bring the divine freedom, and people think it means liberty and licentiousness. I want to bring down the higher peace, and people turn it into complacency and laziness. So it is not that. It is going beyond sin and virtue. Like the divine can destroy an entire universe and he is not stained. He can kill. There is that line in Who, when Aurobindo speaks of the divine, he slays without stint and is full of compassion. So compassion and the act of slaying. He rides in the car and he strikes in the spears. He wars for the world and its ultimate years. He engages himself in the ruthless of battles, and at the same time his benevolent hand is generous to a default. There is a little poem of Aurobindo, Epiphany, where he brings two faces of Shiva. One which is benevolent, Ashutosh, gives anything and everything to anyone. Even the Asuras come and they pray to him and ask for heaven, Shiva would give it away. But there is the other side, which if it comes out, there is the world destroying and shaking force, and everybody, even the saints and sages, are frightened and they take refuge and say, we surrender to thee. So here, sin and virtue leave the cosmic list. They struggle no more in our delivered hearts. Our acts chime with God's simple, natural good, or serve the rule of a supernal right. A first perfection stage is reached at last. Out of the wood and stone of our nature stuff, a temple is shaped where the high gods could live. As a result of this process, this wood and mud is changed into a temple, marble temple of the divine, a first betrothal of the earth to heaven, a deep concordat between truth and life. A camp of God is pitched in human time. So we'll take a pause here.